My name is Sophia, and I'm 35 years old. I never imagined my quiet days as a literature teacher would one day turn into a battle between reason and emotion. The classroom has always been my refuge, a place where stories lived safely between pages, where feelings could be explored from a distance, never too close to hurt. But life, I've learned, doesn't always respect boundaries. Sometimes it writes its own chapters. It began as all ordinary days do, with sunlight spilling across the desks and the low hum of students settling in. My desk was tidy, papers neatly stacked, the day's lesson already in my mind. The chalk in my hand felt familiar, reassuring. I took a breath, turned to face the class, and began as I always did, with poetry. I always found poetry to be the safest way to speak about the unspeakable. It lets you say everything without saying anything at all. That morning, as I read aloud lines from Nehuda, something shifted. I felt eyes on me, not the usual glances of distraction or polite attention, but a gaze that seemed to linger a moment too long. It wasn't intrusive, not yet, just noticeable, enough to make my heart pause. I ignored it, focused instead on the words. That's what I was good at hiding behind literature, letting metaphors do the talking. But even the safest places can become unfamiliar. In the weeks that followed, that same gaze returned, always quiet, always respectful, but constant. There was no conversation beyond the classroom, no inappropriate exchanges. Nothing to define the unease that slowly crept into my chest. Still, I felt it, something shifting in the air between us, too delicate to name, too dangerous to entertain. I told myself it was nothing, just a student, just admiration for the subject. But deep down, I knew better. There's a difference between curiosity and connection, and what I was beginning to feel was something else entirely. It was subtle, like the slow build of a symphony before the crescendo, a warmth that bloomed in moments I wasn't prepared for, while handing back assignments, while answering questions, while sharing lines from love poems written centuries ago. The classroom became quieter in a different way, not from silence, but from tension, soft, emotional, and hard to ignore. I started to dread certain lessons, especially those about longing or unspoken desire. How could I read those words when I was beginning to live them? Each sentence I taught seemed to echo with something more personal, as though the authors had foreseen my struggle. There was a day when the rain fell hard against the windows, drowning out every sound but my own voice. I had chosen a piece by Rilke, one about love that can't be named. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I held the book. I looked up only once and regretted it, because in that single glance, something passed between us, a flicker, a knowing. It wasn't spoken, it never would be, but it existed. That moment haunted me. At home, I'd sit alone in my kitchen, drinking tea that grew cold in my hands. I told myself stories to rewrite the truth. He's just attentive. It's a phase. You're imagining it. But the heart doesn't care for logic, and mine was beginning to ache in ways I couldn't control. I had spent my life learning how to build walls. Professionalism, maturity, experience. But none of those things protected me from feelings I never expected. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. And yet, it arrived anyway, not like a storm, but like a whisper. The kind of whisper that lingers long after the sound has faded. Each day I stood in front of that class, I fought an invisible war between the duty I owed to my profession and the confusion unraveling inside me. And still I smiled. Still I taught. Still I pretended. Because no one could know, and because I didn't even know how to name what I was feeling. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about rules. It was about the heart choosing something it never should have. And once it did, no amount of logic could undo it. The classroom stayed quiet, but inside me, something loud had begun. Each day I returned to that classroom, I told myself I was strong enough to carry on, that I could separate the lessons from the feelings, the hours from the emotions that crept in between them. But denial, I've come to understand, doesn't erase the truth. It only delays its arrival. At first, it was easy to pretend. Teaching is a routine, and routines are comforting. There's structure, timing, control. I clung to those things: lesson plans, attendance sheets, literary analysis. I poured my energy into Shakespeare, Austen, Bron, authors who wrote about love as something beautiful and broken, poetic and painful. I could speak about their stories with clarity, with distance, until one day I couldn't. There was a moment, it's always a moment, isn't it, when I was explaining a passage from Wuthering Heights, trying to capture that raw, aching kind of love that defies sense. I remember pausing, words hanging in the air, and realizing my voice had gone softer. I had drifted into the very feeling I was trying to explain. I looked at the class, at the familiar rows of faces, and felt the fear rise quietly in my chest. Because I knew which face I couldn't look at for too long. I knew which voice I'd come to recognize even before it spoke. Every lesson, every hour, every glance, it all brought me closer to a truth I didn't want to see. This wasn't admiration. It wasn't fleeting. It wasn't harmless. It was something growing, something real, and it terrified me. I started to find reasons to shift my gaze, to move more quickly through parts of the syllabus that once felt like poetry to me. But emotion has a way of bleeding through even the strongest lines. It would catch me off guard. An answer given too thoughtfully, a smile held a second too long. I began to feel the walls I'd built trembling, piece by piece. Outside the classroom, I would replay the day in my mind, searching for signs that I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to convince myself that it was only my heart playing tricks on me. But there was a softness in certain exchanges, an ease that frightened me more than any overt gesture ever could. It was too quiet to be noticed by anyone else, but I felt it like a weight on my chest. Sometimes I would find myself staring at the same paragraph in a book for minutes, unable to read, unable to focus. My mind would wander to thoughts I didn't want to have, to a future I knew could never exist. It was cruel, this feeling, beautiful but cruel. One afternoon, the final bell had already rung, and the classroom was empty except for me. The light from the windows had turned golden, soft shadows stretching across the floor. I sat alone at my desk, papers untouched, heart heavy. I realized in that moment that I was no longer the teacher who walked into that room months ago. Something had shifted in me, not because of anything that was done or said, but because of what had quietly unfolded inside. It's strange how love, if that's even the word for it, doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it enters like silence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. And sometimes it feels like fear. Not fear of the other person, but fear of who you become when you feel something you know you shouldn't. I had always believed I was immune to this. Too experienced, too mature, too grounded to ever let myself fall into something so complicated, so inappropriate. But feelings don't care about timelines or roles or rules. They arrive when they want, and this one had arrived without permission. I still stood in front of that class, still read aloud the works of others, still asked the same questions. But every answer brought me closer to the thing I couldn't unfeel. I had become the very story I used to teach with caution, a woman standing too close to a line, praying she never crosses it. I wish I could say I found clarity, that one day the feeling passed and I went back to who I was before. But I can't, because the truth is, it didn't pass. It stayed, quiet, constant, and always just beneath the surface. It became a pattern I could no longer ignore. How I began each day with determination, promising myself I would stay composed, that I would not feel what I knew I wasn't supposed to. I dressed carefully, chose the right tone, kept every expression measured. It was my way of building walls, invisible ones, tall and firm. I thought if I stayed behind them, nothing could get in, not the emotion, not the longing, not him. At school, I became an expert at pretending. I smiled the right amount, offered guidance with kindness but distance, always keeping the line clear. I corrected myself even before anyone else could. Every time I caught myself slipping, holding eye contact too long, reacting too warmly to a question, pausing before answering, I would retreat. I would remind myself who I was, and what I could never allow. But feelings have a way of slipping through the smallest cracks. I remember the day he lingered after class to ask about a poem. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have mattered. But the way he listened, the softness in his eyes, it chipped something in me. I answered calmly, nodding, gesturing toward the book, but my heart was beating in a way I hadn't felt in years. The kind of rhythm that warns you, this isn't safe. I went home that night and sat in silence for hours. I stared at my bookshelves, the framed degrees, the photos of moments I was proud of. A quiet life, carefully built, but something about that moment after class kept echoing, not because of what he said, but because of how it made me feel. Like the wall I'd so carefully constructed had a weakness I didn't know was there. The next day, I doubled down, firmer voice, straighter posture. I avoided eye contact when I didn't need to make it, and I stuck to the lesson like a script. I told myself it was working, but the ache inside me said otherwise. It wasn't love, not yet. I don't even know if it ever was. It was the possibility of it that scared me. The idea that someone could see past the title, past the role, past the age, and somehow reach the part of me I kept buried. I had spent years building a life that was predictable, safe. But now I found myself searching for meaning in small things. How he tilted his head when he listened, how he smiled when he understood something deeply. Those weren't moments I should have held onto, but I did. Every time I started to feel something, I would rebuild the wall. I would stay late grading papers. I would distract myself with books I'd already read, with dinners eaten too quickly, with noise that tried to cover the silence in my heart. But no matter how many walls I built, my heart kept breaking through, quietly, gently, as if it didn't care how much it hurt me to feel. There were nights I would cry without knowing exactly why. It wasn't sadness, not completely. It was the heaviness of wanting something I couldn't have, of feeling something I couldn't name. I didn't want to fall. I didn't want to betray the trust placed in me. But I was human, and sometimes just being human is enough to make everything harder. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window as I stood in front of the class. I looked calm, controlled, like someone who had everything together, but inside, I was fighting myself. I was trying so hard to be the person I believed I needed to be. Strong, focused, unshaken, yet with every passing day, I could feel how close I was to breaking, because the heart doesn't care about rules. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply moves quietly and without warning. And no matter how high I built the walls, no matter how careful I was, a part of me kept slipping through the cracks, reaching for something that I knew could never be mine. The days passed, but it was the nights that grew heavier. That's when everything I pushed aside would return, slowly, quietly, like a shadow slipping through the door I forgot to lock. During the day, I kept myself busy. I taught with purpose, planned ahead, stayed focused. But when night fell and the world quieted, so did my defenses. I would sit alone in the living room, the soft hum of the city far in the distance, and let my thoughts wander where I didn't allow them to go in daylight. I never said his name aloud. I never spoke of what I was feeling to anyone, but in those silent hours I didn't have to. The emotions said enough on their own. I started staying awake later than usual. I told myself I had papers to grade, books to reread, lessons to prepare. But deep down, I knew I was avoiding sleep, because sleep meant dreams, and dreams didn't care about rules. Dreams pulled me into what I denied during the day, into feelings too deep and too complicated to face with the lights on. I'd sit with a cup of tea, untouched for hours, staring at nothing in particular. Just thinking, remembering, moments that meant nothing on the surface but everything underneath. A question he'd asked in class, the way he'd smiled at something I said, the quiet nod of understanding when I read something sad. These weren't memories I wanted to keep, but I kept them anyway. The hardest part was how unspoken it all was. Nothing had ever been said, nothing ever would be. There were no promises, no confessions, no lines crossed. And yet, it was the silence between us that said the most. It lived in the pauses, in the way we both avoided the obvious. I knew he felt something, though he never showed it in any way that broke the rules. That's what made it harder, because it was real, and yet it wasn't allowed to exist. Some nights I'd stand by the window, watching the lights flicker in distant apartments, wondering about the lives being lived behind them. I'd imagine couples talking, laughing, arguing, making up. Lives that were messy but honest. Mine felt quiet, orderly, but full of noise inside, unspoken noise. There was a kind of grief in it. Not for something lost, but for something that never got the chance to become. I wasn't mourning a relationship. I was mourning the space inside me that had opened up and didn't know what to do with its emptiness. Because once you feel something that deep, even if you hide it, you can't unfeel it. I remember one night in particular. The rain was steady, tapping against the windows in a rhythm that almost felt like a heartbeat. I had a book in my lap, one I'd taught many times before, but I couldn't read it. The words blurred, not from tiredness, but from the weight pressing down on me. I felt alone, not because I was by myself, but because there was no one I could tell the truth to. No one who would understand how something could feel so wrong and still hurt so much to bury. I wanted to forget. I wanted to turn it off, whatever had been awakened in me, but love, or whatever this fragile, forbidden thing was, doesn't disappear just because you want it to. It lingers in silence, especially when the silence is all you have left. I learned to live with the ache, to carry it quietly, to smile when I needed to speak when I was supposed to, and to keep everything else locked away for the hours no one could see. Those late nights became both a refuge and a burden. The only time I could truly feel what I wasn't allowed to say. And sometimes I'd sit there long after midnight, whispering the words I never had the courage to speak in daylight, letting them echo through the stillness, unanswered. There were mornings when I woke with a pit in my stomach, not from dread exactly, but from the weight of something I couldn't outrun. I would look at the clock, listen to the quiet hum of the city outside, and feel the two sides of me already beginning their silent argument. One side reminded me of my role, my responsibility, the boundaries I had promised myself never to cross. The other side whispered of the softness that had begun to stir inside me, uninvited, unrelenting. I never asked for this. I never wanted to feel anything beyond what was expected. And yet, somehow, I found myself caught in the space between what I should do and what I couldn't stop feeling. That's where the battle began, not out loud, but inside me every day, every hour I spent standing in that classroom pretending everything was fine. There were times when I felt strong enough to ignore it, to focus solely on the lesson, the syllabus, the structure I had always relied on. But even then, something as simple as a question asked too gently, or a look held just a second too long, would pull me back into that dangerous place. A place where I didn't know whether I was still in control, or if the line between duty and desire had already started to blur. I remember sitting at my desk one afternoon after class, the room finally empty, sunlight beginning to stretch across the floor in slow gold lines. I stared down at a stack of essays, but my mind was far from them. I kept hearing his voice, the way he'd asked about a character in the novel we were studying. Not just the words, but the way he said them, like he already knew the answer but wanted to hear it from me. It wasn't about flirtation. It never was. That would have made it easier to dismiss. No, it was something quieter, a connection that made me feel seen, not as a teacher, not as a figure of authority, but as a person. And that was what scared me most, because I had worked so hard to keep that part of myself hidden. Now it was being uncovered slowly, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. I started to avoid those moments. I kept the classroom door open. I asked questions without waiting for the answers. I moved through lessons quickly, afraid of what would happen if I let myself slow down and feel. But no matter how careful I was, the feeling remained. That pull, that ache that settled deep in my chest, right between guilt and longing. There were days when I felt ashamed for feeling warmth when I knew I shouldn't, ashamed for waiting, even unconsciously, for a smile, a word, a glance. But there were also days, fewer but more dangerous, when I didn't want to fight it. Days when I wished things were different, when I let myself imagine a world where age and titles and rules didn't matter, a world where we were just two people who had found each other unexpectedly. But that wasn't reality, and I couldn't afford to forget that. Every time I felt myself slipping, I pulled myself back with reminders of what I stood to lose. My work, my dignity, my peace of mind. I had responsibilities to my students, to my reputation, to the life I had built. I told myself that feelings meant nothing if they caused harm, and I believed it. Most of the time, still, the battle continued, quietly, constantly, a war between what I knew and what I felt, between who I was and who I was becoming in the presence of someone I could never have. Sometimes I wished he had never enrolled in my class. Other times I was grateful for the way he made me feel, alive, vulnerable, human. But gratitude came with guilt, and guilt came with silence. I carried it all like a weight, invisible but always pressing down. And so I walked that fragile line every day, never knowing how close I was to falling. I used to believe that love arrived in grand moments, like in the books I'd taught over the years. I imagined it would come with certainty, permission, timing. But what no one ever tells you is that the realest kind of love doesn't ask for the right time. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't ask if it's allowed. It just happens. And when it does, it changes everything, especially the parts of yourself you thought were settled. It happened slowly. There was no defining moment, no sudden spark. just a quiet unfolding, a comfort that grew in small interactions, in the way he listened more deeply than anyone else in the room, how he understood things without me having to explain them twice. There was something about the way he existed in my classroom, never trying to stand out, never crossing any line, and yet somehow becoming the center of my awareness without even knowing it. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was admiration, a passing feeling, something my heart had created to fill an empty space I didn't even realize was there. But the more I resisted, the more it settled in. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and sure, and that was what made it feel so real, so undeniable. I never meant for it to happen, and I never let it show. But inside, something had shifted. I found myself thinking about him during the most ordinary moments, waiting for the kettle to boil, folding laundry, walking home after work. He was in the background of everything, like a song playing low, one you couldn't stop hearing even if you tried. And yet I fought it every day. I reminded myself of who I was, what I stood for, what I could never become. I buried it under professionalism, under distance, under carefully drawn boundaries. I smiled just enough, spoke just enough, and convinced myself it was enough. But inside I was unraveling, because I knew what was growing in me was real, and I had no place to put it. There were times I would lie awake at night, wondering how something so beautiful could feel so wrong. Not wrong because of him. He had never done anything to lead me to this place, but wrong because I had allowed myself to feel in a space where feeling was forbidden. I was the one who was supposed to know better, and yet I was the one who had fallen hardest. Sometimes I would catch myself watching him the way one watches a sunset they know won't last long, quietly, with reverence, and with the ache of knowing it's fleeting. I never wanted anything more than to be near him, just to be understood in the way he somehow understood people, gently, without judgment. What scared me the most was that it didn't feel like infatuation. It didn't feel like a fantasy or a temporary distraction. It felt honest. It felt like the kind of love I had never dared to hope for. One that saw past surfaces and circumstances. One that arrived not because it was supposed to, but because something inside me was finally ready to feel again. Still, I never said a word. I kept my distance. I respected the lines I could never cross. And maybe that's what made it all the more painful, knowing that what I felt was real, but that I would never be able to express it. I had found something that made my heart wake up, and yet I had to let it stay hidden in silence. There's a strange kind of loneliness in loving someone you can't have, especially when that love is quiet and good. It makes you question everything you've ever believed about timing, about worthiness, about who gets to feel what and when. I used to think love had to come at the right moment, under the right circumstances, but it didn't. It came when it was least allowed, but most real, and I will carry that truth with me always. Sometimes the hardest part of a story is knowing when to close the chapter, even when your heart isn't ready. I never thought I'd feel this way. I never thought someone so unexpected, so far from what I imagined, could leave such a mark on my soul. But he did, without even trying, and now, as the days pass and the end draws near, I know I have to let go. Not because I want to, but because it's the only right thing left to do. He'll go on with a future full of dreams, and I'll stay behind these quiet walls, carrying the memory of something that never had a name, but meant more than most things that did. I won't forget the way he made me feel, not with words, but with presence, with the way his silence understood mine, with the way his eyes held stories we never dared to speak. This wasn't a love that could live in the world. It was meant to be felt in silence, honored in distance, and remembered in the heart. So this is good. Bye, Not to him, but to the part of me that hoped for more, and maybe that's what love truly is. Not what we keep, but what we carry, quietly, gently, forever. Goodbye.